For those of you who don't know me, I'm Sarah Zaro. I'm an assistant professor in the history department here at Western, and it's my pleasure to introduce David Shneer to you. David Shneer is the Louis P. Singer Endowed Chair in Jewish History, Professor of History and Jewish Studies, and Chair of the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Colorado Boulder. He's also the faculty director for Yiddishkeit and co-editor-in-chief of East European Jewish Affairs. His research focuses on 20th century European, Russian, and Jewish history and culture. And his first book, Through Soviet Jewish Eyes, Photography, War, and the Holocaust, won the Jordan Schnitzer Prize of the Association for Jewish Studies and was a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award. His other books include Queer Jews, which was a finalist for the Lambda Literary Award, Yiddish and the Creation of Soviet Jewish Culture, which was a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award as well, and New Jews, The End of the Jewish Diaspora. And David comes here today through the generosity of the History Department, the Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies Program, the Ray Wolpow Institute for the Study of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Crimes Against Humanity, the Dean's Office, the Diversity Fund, and his trip here was made possible through the Distinguished Lecture Program of the Association for Jewish Studies. And so we are so happy to have David with us here this evening to discuss the memorial to the Nazi persecution of gay men and lesbians. Who and what are we remembering? There will be time for questions after the talk, as well as coffee, tea, vegetables. So please join me in welcoming David Shneer.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you to all of you for being here. I really want to thank Sarah Zaro for inviting me and to the AJS for hosting this distinguished lecture series. And I also learned that Ray Wolpow is in the house. So I just wanted to thank you very much for having set up this institute, and just props to you and props to all of you guys for being interested in. So I'm going to talk for maybe 20 minutes, and then that will leave us like 30 to 40 minutes for conversation. I don't like to think of it as a Q&A. I like to think of it as more of a conversation. So what are we doing here? Yet the light is still out, but I had to pick a time. So evening. So I'm going to be talking about the history of the actual persecution of gay men and lesbians, since sexual and transgender people as identity categories did not really exist in this time period, and then unfold the history of that group's memorialization process and look at the three kinds of LGBT. So now I'm including L. So L is lesbian, G is gay, B is bi, T is trans, and at some point in the future of the slides, you'll see an I, which is intersex, and Q, which is queer. Look at three ways that these groups are memorializing their own history of persecution. And then we're going to tie it into Jewish memorialization practices and ask about the comparisons. So what gets to count as a genocide, what doesn't get to count as a genocide. And this is going to be where politics sort of really emerge in a visceral way. So here's what I would like us all to be thinking about as I'm narrating this story for you. So first is, what is the history of Nazi persecution? And which persecutees were considered genocide, and which ones were just considered persecution? And most importantly, why do we care about this difference between who gets to claim genocide and who doesn't get to claim genocide? Why do we want to know this history? Do we think we will become better people knowing of past suffering? And I tell my students in all of my classes. So I teach a 150-person lecture class called Holocaust and Genocide Studies through a global perspective. And the first day I tell people, knowing this is not going to make you a better person. Doing something about what you know is going to maybe make you a better person. So is there a connection between knowing the facts about the history and creating this memorial? And how does memorializing transform individuals, either to become vengeful about past wrongs and use past victimization to justify contemporary actions, or to become committed to preventing contemporary wrong. And then the last question that I want us to be, these are all rhetorical questions. We're not going to come to any answers to these. Does never again mean never again in history or never again to us, whatever group is doing this, saying never again? Any questions about where we're going before we jump in? Okay, so let's actually jump into a basic sort of history lesson about the Nazi state. And I was teaching Professor Zero's class earlier, and the definition of the Holocaust that someone beautifully came up with was that it was about the persecution of Jews and others by Nazi Germany for racial reasons, racial and ideological reasons, which is exactly right. I think that's the right definition of the Holocaust. And so I put up here, what does that actually mean in practice? So if you think about what a racial state means, you need to sort of cleanse the gene pool of your racial state. And that is both by eliminating unwanted racial groups, and I put those groups on the left, but it's also then about sort of negative and positive, or eliminating and increasing the gene pool. So you want to eliminate bad genes in the Aryan population, and you want to add good genes to the Aryan population. So you increase the birth rates of good Aryans, which involve things like taking Aryan children whose parents may have been killed in the war and actually having them be raised in Aryan households. That's one way you can sort of increase the birth rate of Aryans. You can also give prizes for Aryan women who have like multiple children. Like you have 3 kids, you get like a silver star. And you have 4 kids, you get a gold star. And if you have 5 kids, you get like a platinum star. I'm making those up, but you get the point. So that's positive eugenics. And then negative eugenics is sort of decreasing the birth rates among Aryans whom you don't want to be procreating. And so these are some of the ways that that happened. And now here's the thing about homosexuality, and I'm going to use that term because they use that term, and it sort of is easier because we don't actually have to talk about gender and sex, and we're just calling it homosexuality, even though it's not a contemporary term that we like to use. But where does homosexuality fit into this racial state structure? Is it a disease that needs to be eliminated, or is it just a bad social habit that can be, what's the word I want to use? I was going to say beaten out of you, basically therapied out of you. So that's the question that's going to be hanging over the talk about history. Okay, so we begin at the beginning of the German state. So the German state was founded very late in European history. It was not established until 1871. And the first legal code had a paragraph in it called number 175. Have any of you guys seen the documentary film Paragraph 175? Okay, a couple of you have. So it's all about this paragraph. But the important point is this was on the law books from the birth of the state. And here is the text of that paragraph. So this is about men. It's gay men engaging in unnatural sex acts. That's left undefined. From the very beginning of the state, there's active opposition to getting this removed from the legal code. And to really sort of make it a campaign. And I call him the person who invented the notion of gay rights, as a guy named Magnus Hirschfeld. So how many of you have ever heard of Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld? Okay, I'm impressed. Usually I don't get that many hands. So good jobs, Dr. Yeah, good job, Dr. Zero. So he had many strikes against him if you're Hitler. So he was Jewish, he was a socialist, and he was a gay man. So that in the sort of Hitlerian universe makes 3 strikes, and he actually then fled the country as soon as Hitler came to power. So here's a little bit of background about him. In 1897, I'm not going to read these slides to you, but in 1897 he founded what I call the first gay rights organization in the world, called the Scientific Humanitarian Committee. And you can see these are a list of the who's who of the German intellectual community, 3 of whom happen to be Jewish. So Einstein, Brode, and Buber. Rainer Maria Rilke, who's the poet, he was like he was a liberal poet. And so these guys were all advocating for the removal of paragraph 175. And Hirschfeld's, this humanitarian committee ends up becoming a sort of research center for what he called sexology, which is basically the study of human sexuality. And so you can see the kinds of things that he was studying from a scholarly perspective. And he actually invented the word transvestite, so cross-dressing, transvestite. So here is a cartoon which was part of the Repeal 175 campaign. And this is the actual text which I had on the first slide. So Hirschfeld then sets up the Institute for Sexual Research in Berlin, which makes Berlin in the interwar, so between World War I and World War II period, so we're talking 1918 to 1933, makes Berlin ground zero for the global gay rights movement and global gay culture in general. And it basically starts to be centered with him and the fact that his center is there, but it also then bleeds out into culture through cabaret and all sorts of other kinds of cultural and entertainment activities. But you can see, I love this, a museum devoted to, quote, erotic folkways. What kinds of things do you, I don't want to open a book called An Instruction Manual to Erotic Folkways. I mean, this was some of the first literature to be having taken these, taken eroticism from a scholarly standpoint. And they give free medical advice. So, as I said, Berlin was a queer mecca. And I'm using the word queer here sort of as a sexual and gender identities. I can talk more about that in the conversation period, why I'm choosing to use the terms I'm using. But you can see that Berlin was the home of one of the most vibrant and celebrated queer cultural scenes in the world. How many of you have seen the movie Cabaret or the play Cabaret? So that gives you a little bit of, I mean, it's obviously it's very extreme vision of what Berlin was like in the late 1920s, which is when Cabaret is set into the early 1930s. But it's not that exists kind of club and life. And in 1929, with Social Democratic and Communist Party support, the Reichstag nearly defeated paragraph 175. They were this close. And one other fun fact, just about Berlin itself, the Jews were roughly 4% of the population in Berlin, even though they were only 0.5% of the population in the whole country. So Berlin, you can see how Berlin is going to be marked in a particular way, as the queer capital, but also as the Jewish capital, which means that when National Socialism or Nazism comes to power, and that emerges in southern Germany, Berlin is going to be needed to be drain the swamps of Berlin. So we have drained the swamps in Washington, D.C. Hitler was draining the swamps in Berlin. Okay, so I want to give you some basic data about who actually, the point is it's on the legal books, but does anybody actually get convicted or brought in even on charges of violating paragraph 175? And just to give you some context, do you guys know when the version of paragraph 175 was rendered illegal in this country by the Supreme Court? No. 2003. Excellent. Extra points. I can't give you points, but props. In the Lawrence v. Texas case, which rendered sodomy illegal across the country. So this, and actually that only happened in 2003, and people are usually shocked that it was that late in this country. So we should not be beating up on Germany for having had this law in the books. It was basically a global phenomenon, that in the West, at least, male-to-male sex acts, unnatural sex acts, were against the law. We didn't tend to use that much, we didn't tend to prosecute that many people here in this country, but you can see the numbers. This is before National Socialism. This is in the first third of the 20th century. So you can see that the four figures for convictions pops up in the mid-1920s. And I don't know how to attribute that. But you can see that there's actually not an insignificant number of people actually being arrested on violating paragraph 175 and actually being convicted of the crime. Okay, so Hitler is appointed chancellor and then appointed chancellor in January 1933 by Hindenburg. So we don't need to get into a sort of political German politics class, but the president appoints the chancellor and Hindenburg appoints Hitler because anything but the communists was sort of Hindenburg's running motto. And one of the first things that Hitler and his National Socialist Party does is targets Hirschfeld's Institute. And I don't know if you've seen these photographs of book burnings. People assume that it's like Jewish books being burned, but usually the photographs actually are of the libraries at the Institute of Sexual Research's books being burned. So that was the first big public book burning in Nazi Germany, May 10th, 1933. Hirschfeld was out of the country at this point in time, and he actually died in Nice, in France, 2 years after, actually 1 year, 2 years after this took place. But you can see how he is vilified in the Nazi press. So Der Stürmer was the sort of leading National Socialist newspaper, and this is an image, a caricature of Hirschfeld. And so you can see Nazi youth marching in front of, that's his institute, the looting of the library, and then the burning of the library. So I don't know how many of you know that amongst the National Socialist leadership, there were a number of not openly gay men, but closeted, but knowingly, people knew that they were gay men, and including the head of the Sturmabteilung, or the SA, which was the sort of paramilitary troops for, AKA the thugs, for National Socialism. And in 1934, Hitler has them completely purged, including their leader, Ernst Röhm. And basically, this was about consolidating power in the sort of more official sources of state violence, which are namely the Wehrmacht, the German army, and the official police, the Sicherheitsdienst. That's the secret police, the security police. But he basically felt like he had to get rid of this sort of alternative source of authority, and maybe, so the communists were actually targeting Röhm with their own propaganda about how National Socialists are men. And so Hitler felt like he had to do something about that propaganda. So I didn't put up a cartoon, some of the communist cartoons, but they actually have him sort of bending over for these very effeminate young men in the communist press, mind you. So both sides are using sexuality as a weapon against their enemies. Okay, so so he purges the SA and Röhm in particular in 1934, and then in 1935, Heinrich Himmler broadens paragraph 175 and adds a new paragraph called A. And you can see 175 is very short, and Himmler's edition is like 4 times the length of the original article. So I gave you the entire text here, and I'm going to send this PowerPoint to Dr. Zero for if you guys are interested in having these slides. But basically what it says is you don't actually have to do anything to be prosecuted according to paragraph 175. It's basically anyone who feels like there's been an innuendo about some kind of potential unnatural act between men, they can be brought up on charges of violating paragraph 175, subclause A. And this is when arrest rates go way up. So you'll see, the other thing Himmler does is in 1936, he creates the Central Office for the Combating of Homosexuality and Abortion. What do those two things have in common?
Reducing the birth rate.
Okay, so both homosexuality, because gay men presumably, though not in fact, presumably are not procreating, and abortion because that is a child a fetus that got aborted is therefore not going to come to become part of the gene pool for the Aryan nation. And then the next thing he does, in 1941, World War II has already broken out. The Nazi state passes the death penalty for SS homosexuals. And so this is groundbreaking research that a colleague of mine, Jeffrey Giles, has been working on. So he studies the SS, which he apparently has learned that had a very high number of gay men in its ranks. And that's why Himmler sort of specifically targeted the SS. You don't want to have your elite basically flagrantly violating all of your laws. So you'll notice that there has been no mention yet of female same-sex encounters. That's not because the Nazis weren't bothered by it. It's because they did not see it as a legal issue under the same law. So paragraph 175 was about men, and 175A was basically innuendos between men. But lesbians were persecuted under the asocial category. So what do lesbians have that gay men do not have? Just basic, biology. They have the ability to procreate on their own. So I suspect that the paragraph 175 did not end up including women because when it got amended in 1935, because lesbians actually could procreate with good Aryan babies. So if they were caught engaging in lesbian activity, they were definitely sent to concentration camps. But they were not sent under violating paragraph 175. They were sent under committing asocial acts. So it's a social crime, not a legal crime. And so I'm actually relying on the research by Anna Haikova, who now teaches at the University of Warwick. And she's going to reappear later in the talk when we get to the memorialization conversation. Okay, so this is now the statistics under Nazi Germany for prosecutions under paragraph 175. So what do you notice here?
It peaked at 139, then goes way down.
So it peaks, so we're looking at this column.
I know.
So this is more or less a similar rate to the high rates before Nazism came to power, right? Remember, there was 2 years when it was 4 figures, but it was a 1 at the front of those 4 figures. So this is like close to 4 figures, 853, 948. But then in 1935, it jumps more than twofold. And then in 1 year, it jumps more than twofold. And then you can see it keeps, and then it settles in at around 8,000 prosecutions in 37, 38, and 39. And then it mysteriously decreases. Why do you think it decreases between 1939 and 1940? What major event happened in 1939?
They had a whole bunch of other stuff on their plate to worry about.
That is true, which is? No, I mean, yes, Czechoslovakia happened in early 1939. They invaded Poland, declaring World War II started. So they actually needed their men not to be in concentration camps. They needed them to be fighting on the front. That is why these numbers go back to the earlier numbers. Okay, so while gay men are in the concentration camps, these are some of the things that happen to them. So remember, the sort of fundamental question is gayness, is there a gene for gayness? And if there is, then what has to happen to gay men? If you're living in this Nazi racial universe, what has to happen to gay men? They have to be sterilized. If it's genetic, they have to be sterilized because you don't want to pass on this disease to the future generation of Aryans. Jews, Slavs, no problem. They can procreate all they want because they're not going to exist in the future Reich. But Aryans are going to exist, and we want to sort of cleanse the gene pool. What if it's not? So you're going to sterilize them if it is a genetic disease, but what if it's just a social issue, like it is for lesbians? So yes, you can give them therapy. What kind of therapy do you imagine happens in a concentration camp? It's not shitty chat talk therapy. You could torture them. Yeah? Yes. So, right, so men were actually forced to go to brothels. Gay men were forced to go to brothels at concentration camps in Dachau and Sachsenhausen. I mean, I don't think it cured them of anything, but if those women got pregnant, then they were doing their duty for the state. So we saw that the highest incarceration rates were in the 30s, right? Not even in the 40s. So this is pre-Holocaust, this is before, this is really a German issue. So they were marked with this pink triangle right here. So that's where you get the pink triangle becoming the symbol of many memorials to this event. And you can see the statistics, about 50,000 homosexuals, and I'm using that word, those are men, homosexual men, were sent to concentration camps, and between 10 and 15,000 died. And then the final sentence, I think, is really telling. So that is a horrible story. And then they are released. If they survive, they're released. And then, what do? They join the army, which means they're fighting for their own oppressor, which is not unusual. Like in the US, like African Americans were going abroad to liberate Europe, and then they came back to Jim Crow South. So that's not an unusual phenomenon, but they're actually committing genocide as part of the German army. So then we have to ask victim, perpetrator, where is the line? Okay, so I skipped the war period, just because we need to move forward. But there are not, so most gay men actually, if they survive the 30s, they actually survive concentration camps through the war. If they die, they end up dying on the front rather than in the concentration camps. But here's the thing. The Allies, they liberate in quotes. We were talking in a class earlier about the sort of squishy definition of liberation. But the Allies, so the Soviet Union, the United States, France, and Great Britain, liberate Germany from National Socialism, but they don't change this law. This law stays on the books, both in the Western Allied occupation zone, which becomes West Germany, and in the Soviet occupation zone, which becomes East Germany. And here's the thing. You can see that the conviction rates don't drop. They actually increase. So they were not as high in these years, but you can see all the way until, so you can see that they drop in 1968 or 69, because that's when the law is changed. And then they drop down to three digits and then down to two digits. But look, even in the 90s, there are people being convicted for violating paragraph 175.
It is true also that the gays were never released from the camps.
I'm sorry, say that question again?
It is true also, because the law stayed in the books, I have read somewhere that the gays were not released from the camp. They were sent right to jail at the liberation.
I assume you guys all heard that question. So yes, that is true, but their sentences were commuted, I guess is the word. So they were not exonerated, but their sentences were commuted.
Which really makes us as bad as the Nazis, in my opinion.
We'll get to that.
Okay.
We'll get to that. So West Germany left the paragraph on the books, and actually what I found really illuminating, Konrad Adenauer, who was the first chancellor of West Germany, this is what he had to say in 1957 when a court upholds paragraph 175. Concerning male homosexuality, the legal system must, more than in other areas, erect a bulwark against the spreading of this vice, which otherwise would represent a serious danger for a healthy and natural life of the people. Who could you imagine saying something like that? Okay. But let's go back to what we're talking about here. Himmler and Hitler would have said something exactly like that. But this is not Nazism. This is post-war Christian democratic Adenauer, who is conservative but not fascist by any means. So you can see that I added up the totals. About 100,000 men are actually indicted and 50,000 men are sentenced to prison on paragraph 175. Only in 1969 does it get reformed to include male sex with minors and homosexual prostitution. This does not include mixed gender. So this is only for male same-sex. And then it stays on the books for the entire history of West Germany. And it only is removed in 1994. Yeah.
So those numbers include the sex with minors after 1969?
Yes.
So with boys specifically, or with girl minors too?
Minors, boys.
Just boys?
Yes. And minors, by the way, is under 18.
Right.
And in Germany, the legal age for consensual sex is like, I think it's 14 or 15. So it just means under 18.
It does mean under 18, not under 14 or...
Correct.
Okay. And was that eventually taken out as its own legal...
So it all got universalized to both. This is about same-sex encounters. So,
No, I'm taking at the majority versus minority of age.
okay.
Having sex with children, did that ever come out as a separate, or what point did that come out as a separate legal issue than
Not children as
homosexual?
teenagers. This is like, so the thing is, throughout history in the West, or at least the past 50 years, the age of
Maybe we can
consent,
hold the discussion until the
Yeah.
end. Thank you.
it's about the age of consent between homosexuality
Yes.
and heterosexuality.
So we'll come back to that. So we'll move on to East Germany. So in East Germany, actually, because it's a socialist state, they actually have a much more progressive relationship to sexual identity. And actually, in the immediate post-war period, many socialists wanted it removed entirely. But more conservative communists end up saying, no, that's going to make us look bad to the West because the West has it on their books. We need to have it on our books. But it's decriminalized in the late 1950s, which means, what does decriminalization mean? It means it's not being prosecuted in the courts. It happens to be on the books, but they're not actually bringing people up on charges. And then they finally remove it from the books in 1968, so long before West Germany does. But then they add an additional one when they took that off the books for criminalizing statutory rape, which is what we're talking about. Yes. And so then in 1989, which is still East Germany, all references to legal distinction between homo and heterosexual acts is removed entirely from the East German legal code. And so basically only West Germany is basically embarrassed by the fact that its communist nemesis is actually more progressive on this issue come the 1990s when they unify. So that's when the entire German legal system basically adopted West Germany's legal system, except this, which then got removed in 1994. And a reminder that the United States did not actually remove this until 2003, props. Okay, so now I want to move to the memorial section of our conversation. So read the first paragraph. Does it make sense why, therefore, memorials to the persecution of gay men did not happen until much later than, say, the memorials to Jews? Or, I mean, there were some small memorials to Sinti Roma, but that happened much later, but especially to Jews, because it was still illegal in most countries. So I sort of outlined three kinds of spaces in which gay men, and at some point we're going to also talk about lesbians, get memorialized. So I'm calling the first group in situ memorials, which are on the territory of the Greater Reich, where the persecution actually took place. So these are German concentration camps. And those memorials, because they're embedded in the camps, in the camp setting, they tend to be focused on the history, on the past. So that's group one, in situ. Group two is activist memorials. And they Lgbt, now we have Q. And those are in cities with very active and visible gay communities. So I've made a list here of at least the ones we'll be talking about tonight. And they focus on commemorating the past in order to create identities in the present. Does that make sense? This is where the political issues are going to arise. And actually, they're going to creep into the in situ memorials as well, which we're going to come to as well. And then the third category is institutionalized Holocaust memorials. When, for example, the US Holocaust Memorial Museum finally starts to talk about homosexuals, imagine that word in quotes all the time when I'm saying it. These memorials don't put it in quotes, by the way. They actually put the word homosexual on the memorial. They organized their first traveling exhibit, I think it was in 1999, is when the US Holocaust Memorial Museum does that. And then I happened to just be in Charleston, and I went to their Holocaust Memorial, and actually this was even earlier than that. No, it was in 2003 that the Charleston Memorial got put up, and it includes persecution of homosexuals in their Holocaust Memorial. And then persecuted gay men are officially pardoned by the German government in 2002, which that basically means, yes, we're sorry, we should never have had that law on the books at all. Sorry that you had to spend time in a concentration camp. And then the Pink Triangle Foundation grants reparations money in 1999. So that is money that the German government is paying to gay organizations for basically educational purposes, filmmaking. So the movie, documentary film, Paragraph 175, got funded from the Pink Triangle Foundation. Okay, so we're going to start off with in situ memorials. So this is the very first in situ memorial, 1984 at Mauthausen. And you can see two gay men here, and this is the pink, I think it's pink granite. And the text is almost always the same. Beaten to death and silenced to death, the homosexual victims of National Socialism. And that text is more or less universal on these memorials. So this is Mauthausen, 1984. There was a huge controversy about this memorial being put up in 1984. So Mauthausen is controlled by the Austrian government. And so the gay men approached the Austrian government and said, you know what, we want to put a memorial. Who do you think said, we do not want to have a memorial to the gay victims of the Holocaust here at Mauthausen?
Catholic Church?
Nope. Not just right-wing Jews. Jews, all Jews. Most mainstream Jews were really upset that the Holocaust was, that the gay memorial was sort of allowing space for things that did not rise to the level of what the Jews went through at the hands of Nazi Germany. And so they posed a huge outcry and lobbied the Austrian government, in fact, to not allow this memorial to be put in place, but the Austrian government controls the space, and they decided to install it in any case. So then the next one is, so now the ball got rolling. So if Mauthausen got it, then all of the other camps that were incarcerating gay men. So Mauthausen is in Austria, so it was not built until 1938, which is when Nazi Germany took over Austria. So Dachau, which was the first camp founded in Munich, it's got its memorial in 1985. So you can see same pink triangle. Neuengamme, pink triangle. Sachsenhausen, a little bit different. It's not a pink triangle. It's a plaque on a wall. And I actually visited this plaque. Here's me. This is maybe 2 years ago. Selfie. I'm not a good selfie taker. But so there's the plaque in situ. So I am making a pilgrimage to this memorial. Okay. So now let's talk about how gay communities start to create activist memorials in urban settings. So the very first one that actually gets established is in Amsterdam, believe it or not, which has a very vibrant at this time, L and G community, a lesbian and gay community. And so this is the memorial that got established, and the lobbying that it got to have this get established was huge, as you can imagine, but it ended up happening. And one thing that I think is interesting, so you can see that it's the pink triangle. And have any of you been to Amsterdam? Raise your hand if you've been to Amsterdam. Okay, have you been to the Anne Frank house? Okay, have you been to this memorial? Okay. So what I find interesting is the text. This is not the same totgeschlagen, totgeschwiegen, or the Dutch equivalent doodgesch, whatever. I'm studying Dutch, so I'm not making it up. But they actually pulled a quote from a very famous gay Dutch poet named Jacob Israel de Haan, who happens to be a right-wing Zionist who left the Netherlands for Israel, and he was actually the first political assassination in the early pre-state Palestine by a Jew shooting another Jew. So he was considered the first martyr for Zionism. But he also wrote gay literature, and he was a gay man. And so they pulled this text from him. It's in English, it's such an endless desire for friendship, which I think is a very lovely way of thinking about this. And you can see that this is the canal here, and this is the memorial. So I'm going to move a little bit quicker. So this is the memorial in Frankfurt. So each urban place is coming up with its own aesthetic. So if you had the sort of standard pink triangle in Amsterdam, which it's not particularly original, right? You have, I guess, a more Christian figure in Frankfurt with the Frankfurt Angel. And this is in the urban gay neighborhood in Frankfurt. Berlin, in the gay neighborhood Schöneberg at Nollendorfplatz, which is the main train station in Schöneberg, you actually have both the pink triangle, and then this is a blow-up of the plaque beneath the pink triangle. And it's at the train station. This is Cologne. So these are all in Germany, except the first one, which was in Amsterdam. So I actually took these pictures when I lived in San Francisco. This is Pink Triangle Park, which is in the Castro, which is the urban gay neighborhood. And you can see pink triangles. All right, so now here's what I want to do. I want to introduce a new idea about the proximity of memorial space in terms of gay and Jewish. That's going to be where we're going to sort of wrap up. So here's the gay memorial in Frankfurt. And I went on Google, and this is the Jewish quarter, and this is where the gay memorial is. It's maybe a 10-minute walk in the case of Frankfurt. I don't think it's an accident that the gay communities put their memorials in proximity to Jewish centers. It maybe has to do with the fact that these are both very urban communities, but I don't think it's an accident that the memorials also got put in super close proximity. This is actually one of the furthest distances, 10-minute walk. So Amsterdam. So here is a map. I just made this last night. So you can you see the little blue dots? It's like 2-minute walk from the Anne Frank house, which is the bread, to the gay memorial. And here is Anne Frank house, and here's the gay memorial. And it's like right around the corner. I don't think it's an accident. Like, of all the places in all of the canals in Amsterdam to put your gay memorial, that proximity could not have been an accident. I have not done archival research to prove this point, but that's my next step.
Do you think it was positive or negative? Like, because the Jewish community was not very happy with that? Or?
So here, I don't think the Jews objected to these memorials. They objected to them being put into the concentration camps. And so we'll talk about the difference between why did Jews get so upset with the in situ memorials. And that was back in the 80s, by the way. So this is already in the 90s, where things are starting to become, Jews especially are starting to become more liberal and more accepting. And I think globally, I mean, never mind, I'm not going to talk globally. But certainly in Amsterdam, the Jewish community is relatively liberal in terms of sexuality issues.
What about this, like the specificity of like gay Jewish men who were incarcerated? Like, because I know that there were definitely gay Jewish men who were incarcerated. So why would there be like that kind of?
So the question is about gay Jewish men. Can I flag that for you, Sam? We'll come back to it. Okay. So I just want to get through these slides, and then we'll come back to remind me. Okay. It's on you. And then, so Sydney, which is in Australia, this is the Jewish Museum, and this is the Gay Memorial, like 1-minute walk. Again, I don't think it's an accident. And then the last one, which we're going to end with, is Berlin, what's going on back in Berlin, which is the sort of ground zero of a Holocaust commemoration. So this is the memorial to the persecuted, to the homosexuals persecuted, and I put the German word in here, verfolgten, as opposed to ermordeten. Verfolgten is like persecuted, and ermordeten is murdered. So there's a very clear distinction in both English and in German about the degrees of suffering. So I think once they sort of put this up, it was like, okay, the Jews could sort of, like, their hairs went down. There's no presumption that gay men went through a genocide. but that they wanted something to commemorate their persecution under the Nazis. So this is the memorial, and you can see this is the Jewish memorial. This is the gay memorial. Again, maybe it's a 5-minute walk. And then brand new, I think 2013, this was 2008, 2013, the Sinti Roma Memorial. And the Reichstag is just up here on the map. Okay, so read this. And this was about the decision to put up the gay memorial across the street from Eisenman's murdered Jews memorial in Berlin. So you can see he's not a particular fan of the proximity issue. Okay, and then the last is institutionalizing, which is, I think, what we're doing tonight. So the US HMM creates their traveling exhibit, Nazi Persecution of Homosexuals. So more and more memorials are actually including the word homosexuals in urban settings. Today there's actually a whole a street named after Magnus Hirschfeld, and this is on the street where his institute was located. And so there's been Jewish, gay, LGBT controversy about who has the right to commemorate, but there's also internal politics to the L, the G, the B, and the T community. So I took these two photos on the right in 2011. So it's basically this gray box. So it's this, and you peer into that hole, and what you see is two men kissing. That's it. That's the whole memorial. There's no text, there's no interpretive anything anywhere. So it's just two men kissing. And it's sort of in the Tiergarten, which this used to be a historic cruising ground. So cruising is when gay men go walking in the park to sort of find partners to have public sex with. And so I think that was part of the point of having it located deep in this park. I mean, it's not that deep, and it's like 100 meters off the street, but nonetheless, it's got a lot of trees around it. And somebody else came up, and we kind of were doing a little thing. Like, I know why you're here. And he was like, I know why you're here. Which I think was the point of the memorial, sort of replicating that act of cruising, but we're cruising about a memorial. But here's the thing. It was two gay men kissing, or two men kissing. Whether or not they're identified as gay, I don't know. Lesbians said, well, what about two women kissing? Because this is supposed to be a memorial to the homosexuals persecuted under Nazism. It doesn't say anything about paragraph 175. It should be about all of us, and we were all persecuted. So the historians among who were establishing this memorial were like, no, lesbians are not persecuted as homosexuals, they were persecuted as asocials. Therefore, this should not be including lesbians. And the lesbians were like, that's irrelevant, because they didn't invent a law specifically directed to lesbians. We were nonetheless persecuted. The compromise was that they now swap out every 2 years a film of two men kissing and then a film of two women kissing. That was their compromise. And so this is a great podcast if any of you are interested in listening to it about the controversy. And so this is the last thing I just recently learned about. So I mentioned to you Anya Haikova, who is actually doing research on lesbian sexuality in concentration camps. And she's very active with a women's rights group, or with a lesbian feminist group, that is trying to get in Ravensbrück, which is the all-women's concentration camp located maybe 100 kilometers northeast of Berlin in Germany, to put up what's called a Gedenkkugel, which doesn't really translate nicely into English, a memorial ball. But I mean, this is a rendition of what they imagine it might look like. So they propose a memorial to lesbians persecuted by the Nazi regime, but it's not allowed because it was not officially approved. And basically the Ravensbrück, whoever runs Ravensbrück has to approve these memorials. And there was outcry from gay men saying, how dare you put this memorial in Ravensbrück, because lesbians were not persecuted as lesbians. They were there because they were women, not because they were lesbians. So then they said, this is the text Does it say anything about, like, lesbian women among the prisoners of various persecuted groups? Could it be even more nebulous? Like, it's bad writing for one, although this is translation from the German, so to be fair. But the lesbian feminist group said, there's nothing in this sentence that belies the fact that they were not persecuted as lesbians. They happened to be lesbians and they were in this camp. So therefore we should put this memorial up because there were lesbians who were persecuted in this camp. And as of December 2018, so just 2 months ago, there's been no resolution. And this, I think, is part of the issue about in situ memorials, create this sort of heightened level of need for historic specificity, and therefore sort of the emotions internal to LGBTQ, and then I didn't have the I, but I as well, they're all going to be sort of heightening, like whether we fealty to history or fealty to what's going on right now. All right, so I'm wrapping up now. So I'm going to give you 5 conclusions, and then we're going to have a conversation. And I'm going to come back to your question. So all non-camp memorials, and therefore the most visited memorials, so by that I mean the ones in big urban settings, are commemorating something much bigger than the Nazi past, than Nazi persecution. They're commemorating the past, the present, but also I think they're envisioning the future. So 2, remembering Nazi persecution to talk about contemporary oppression of sexual minorities regardless of orientation, gender, or sex. We see that coming up in these debates between gay men and lesbians. Just want to put it out there that no scholar today claims that this is a genocide of gay men. There's no scholarship suggesting otherwise, but a Holocaust memorial increasingly includes homosexuals in their list of victims needing to be commemorated. So it doesn't mean they were victims of the Holocaust, but they are increasingly including groups like asocials and homosexuals in the list of groups persecuted by the Nazis. So 4, I want to suggest that this shows both the power but also the limits of comparison, both in terms of Nazis' other victims. So we're talking about Jews who got really upset when gay men were like, we need a memorial here too for our suffering. So there was controversy there, and you could see Gutmann, who was at Yad Vashem. I think he's passed away maybe by now. But in 2008, he's still upset about the comparison between gay men and Jews. But even then, within the LGBTIQ community, there are gay men who are saying the persecution of lesbians was not at all equivalent to our suffering as gay men. So we need to sort of have some kind of distinction between that, in a similar way that the Jews are saying we need to have some kind of distinction between our experience and the gay male experience. And last is I want to suggest that there's an ambivalence about the mainstreaming of this minority memory. And basically, there was a time when activists actually had to fight to get this talk to happen. And the fact that the AJS, the Association for Jewish Studies, is co-sponsoring this talk is a fantastic thing because you're all learning about something that you probably did not know much about. And there's a loss that there's no kerfuffle about it. Like this does not feel like a political statement that I'm making to you, because we've got young and old, rich and poor. Everybody's in here learning together. And so that's great. And there's a little bit of lament on my part that the sort of political edge of those early fights that had to be fought, we don't have to fight anymore. Okay, so the last place I'm going to take you back to is Tel Aviv, so Israel was basically founded as a sort of a rising from the ashes of the Holocaust, as a Jewish state rising on the ashes of the Holocaust. Therefore, that would probably be the country that's most committed to Jewish memory at all costs. And you saw that in the Gutmann quote. So that's at Yad Vashem. In Tel Aviv, though, which is now the gay, sort of has a lively gay nightlife, or gay culture, in 2014, they actually put up a pink triangle. They were totally not creative. So here's the thing about how they talk about it, because this is political fire in Israel, having gay groups come and say, we want to have a memorial to gay persecution under Nazism. But they were very careful about emphasizing that this is not a genocide, but that they're sharing common histories. Jews and LGBT folk have shared common histories of oppression. And I think we've seen that to be true. And I just want to close with this photograph, which I took students, these are my students, in Tel Aviv, gazing at the memorial. Not a one of them is gay, and so this is like definite mainstreaming of LGBT memory and Nazi persecution. Thank you. And I did want to answer your question about Jewish and gay and why is there so much infighting. So if you were a gay Jew, you were definitely rounded up as Jewish, and only later did they discover that you were gay. So I've heard several, like 2 or 3 gay men who are also Jewish. First thing they say is, I was persecuted as a Jew first. I had my yellow triangle, my yellow star on. Only once I got to the camp did, and they knew they were gay. They themselves knew they were gay, but the Nazis didn't know they were gay. They knew they were Jewish. Only once they came to the camp did they have like these budding romances with their bunkmates. So
they cared more, like, in that context, even if they did, if the Nazis did find out, they wouldn't, like...
Double punish them?
Yeah.
No.
Okay, so we have time for a couple of questions. I will pass the mic and see if you can help me pass the mic as well.
My experience with like this kind of thing is like the thing about
Can you be more specific with this kind of thing?
sorry, like the persecution of LGBT people under Nazis
Mm-hmm.
is that the persecution of LGBT people under Nazis is not special. Like Jews were actually like murdered by the millions, whereas Western countries have been destroying LGBT lives for hundreds of years, and like there's no difference in kind, or there's very little difference in kind between the Nazis and other Western countries, like Great Britain or France or the US.
And yet, I think this urge to put memorials up suggests that what you're saying is not untrue, that there is a long history of persecution of LGBT people, as there is a history of anti-Semitism going back to pre-Christianity. But I'm not picking on you. I'm just saying the Holocaust sort of was this moment in time when Jews were destined for absolute murder. I want to suggest that something similar is going on for LGBT folk, that persecution is sort of expected, and that this sort of came together, sort of crystallized in the 20th century as a focal point for collective memory creation. Oh, sorry, you're calling on people. And can you guys hear me without the mic? Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask a clarifying question. So,
Aryans persecuted for being gay? Were they the only group?
So they were primarily, it was primarily, it's a great question. So in other words, to cleanse the gene pool, only Aryan gay people persecuted, not exclusively. Once they started conquering other places, they would then go in and basically go to gay bars, for example, and send those people to concentration camps. So it was not just, once they started expanding their borders to other countries, they then persecuted gay men as well.
wait, and what was the
So I think that is a perfect example of how they didn't, it was sort of a neither this nor that kind of category, sexual identity. So presumably, if they are definite it's a disease, then of course they're not going to persecute gay French people. But they also recognize that there's something unnatural about what they're doing, and so I think it's also social. So I think that's why they also persecute gay French, gay Dutch, gay Poles.
Yeah, I think I'd like to hear what you have to say about the unity of the anti-gay and the anti-Jewish about most right-wing fascist points of view that set up we're the perfect culture and all the rest of you are scum, unhuman. And to me, I don't know, when I think of it as both, coming, being both persecution, I feel like there's a unity in it of where they're coming from. And I don't know where, and so when I think of the importance of getting Jewish organizations to recognize it and gay organizations, I feel like we have something to teach. All these people need to be taught something about the bigness and breadth of what Nazism was and its children are. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think so. Do I need to repeat the question or the comment? So I took your question to be there's something clearly in common with anti-gay sentiment and anti-Jewish sentiment, certainly in Nazism, but also more broadly in right-wing fascism. I don't disagree with you about that, except, for example, in Italian fascism, Jews were members of the Italian Fascist Party. So I think this is particular to some kind of conservative cultures, and I actually think it has to do with misogyny. So the misogyny so active gay male partners they're not considered gay. If you're penetrating as opposed to being penetrated, the penetratee, I guess is how you would call that, the bottom, for those of you who know the language, is effeminized and is considered the scum of the earth. The person who's penetrating does not have his masculinity in question. So I think there's a misogyny there, and there's a misogyny with Jews who are basically effeminate, and they're portrayed as effeminate. So yes, I agree with you that there's definitely something that we could learn from each other.
Things that the gay people and the Jews and the Gypsies and all the Slavic people, I mean the millions that were murdered in the war, that are seen as as being that the Nazis saw everybody as being so inferior to them that they have this whatever this thing was. They were the perfect people, and everybody else was whatever.
Inferior. So actually, per your point, so I'm doing research right now on for a book project, and actually I found some documents that actually have food allocations based on your race. So Aryan Germans are at the top. You can imagine Jews are like starving, but then there is a label for every different ethnic group, which we would call nationality. So like Dutch, Danes, and Norwegians are sort of close to being perfect Aryans. French are like kind of too much Latin. Italians, Greeks, and Spaniards, Slavs, Poles, and then Jews are way at the bottom. So yeah, but guess what? That's not unique to Nazi Germany. Like we all occupy racialized worlds where we think if you're light-skinned, you have privilege, and if you have darker skin, you don't have privilege. And these are social structures that we're all operating in. And I don't think it's unique to Nazi Germany. They just, I would say, turned up the dial to its maximum and actually put it into policies that ended up starving people to death.
Your idea of kind of topography and the proximity of these memorials, LGBTQ memorials, Jewish memorials, and I have to admit I'm a little bit surprised that they're so close together, thinking about kind of my own like tourism and research routes. And I guess my question is, you say that they're so close together, 10 minutes most, and I'm curious if you've observed any of the kind of tourism infrastructure, whether kind of Jewish heritage tours in Berlin or in Amsterdam are hitting LGBTQ memorials, and if you can comment on that.
Right, so the question is, sorry, you had the microphone. So Jewish tour groups do not include LGBT memorials. In fact, the only way I actually stumbled across this was I actually made it a point to go figure out where the gay memorial is. And I looked into my guidebook and I'm like, oh, it's here. That was the Anne Frank house that we just walked right by. So I sort of stumbled upon it, completely unaware of it. So then I was like, there must be something here. So when I was in Sydney in 2012, I saw on the map that the City Jewish Museum where I was speaking at was literally across the street from the gay memorial. And I'm like, there's clearly something going on here. So then I started doing more research and I actually made those maps. But it's absolutely not, there's no intertwining of these collective memory processes. So they're, and even, I'm going to go even further than that, the gay memorials are not really tourist sites. So Jewish memorials are absolutely tourist sites for Jews and for others. But gay memorials are not tourist sites because, look, if you're a gay tourist hanging out in Berlin, do you really want to go to the Holocaust memorial, like to the memorial to the persecutees of, I mean, somebody else did. I've met him in the park, but there was nobody else around. So it's clear, because gay people are not traveling, gay people who travel want to engage in living community amongst other LGBT folk in whatever city they're in. They don't necessarily want to go hang out at a memorial. Unlike Jews who actually want to sort of experience that. Actually, do you want to pass it back so she can get in and then you can?
You mentioned that lesbians were still, they was atypical. Is there a reason why they believe that like a gay man could, like, it could be genetic, but that a lesbian was not genetic because it's not circulating?
I think it's misogyny. It comes back to misogyny. Like, lesbians are just like, they don't have sexual agency. Women do not have sexual agency, therefore they are vessels for the nation. I think it's as crude as that. Does that make sense?
LGBT people, like, throughout history, not just throughout Nazi Germany, why hasn't there been more, like, advocacy for that kind of specific kind of memorial, and not just
Memorials like to the, can you give me an example of what event? I'm assuming you're wanting sort of like an LGBT history, persecution history.
Yes.
So like in 1330 they were burned at the stake, in 1600 they were tarred and feathered, that kind of thing?
Yeah, because of the lack of, I guess, significance to, I guess, in their lack of, I guess, prominence in the Holocaust versus like their history of persecution. Like, why is there not more about that?
Well, I think it's because this is very new. Like, so you can see the symbol of all of these things is the pink triangle. The Nazis created the pink triangle to mark these people as other, as not as less than. It seems a very odd symbol, at least to me, when Larry Kramer was around, although my husband did manage to interview him, which I'm proud to say. But why he chose the pink triangle as the symbol for ACT UP, which is the to unleash power. But they chose the pink triangle, and Larry Kramer, now I'm talking about, argued that AIDS in America in Reaganite 1980s was kind of like Hitler 1930s Jews. And he actually cites Hannah Arendt and her suggestion that had Jews been more vociferously what's the word I want to use? Resisting, physically resisting, in the same way that gay men should be demanding rights to new treatments, Jews would not have been killed off the way they were, and gay men would not be dying from AIDS the way they are. Basically, he equated Reagan's policies on HIV and AIDS to a genocide. He's the only person I know. I'm not going to evaluate. I think it's a rhetorical device. that he's using, but he actually very deeply engaged with Hannah Arendt and other scholars who were talking about Jewish resistance. And he basically, Larry Kramer wanted to argue that gay men need to actually speak up to basically create a voice for themselves. So he actually got booted out of the gay men's health crisis for having a big mouth. And so he ended up founding ACT UP. And yeah, so that, which was doing like kiss-ins, like it was very in your face. How do we get on this track? Sorry, where do we start? Oh, the history of gay persecution. So why did this event become so big? Because gay as a category is relatively new. Like it's so as a social, so I teach a course called LGBT history, and I started in the late 19th century because as a social category, of course, same-sex acts were happening throughout history. We know that. But as a social category, in terms of publicly identifying oneself, it doesn't really exist until the late 19th century. So I think it's that newness, unlike Jews who have been like Jews sort of, I don't know, from post-biblical period, let's just say. So for gay LGBT folk, it's a relatively new experience. So I think they're still trying to work out what their history looks like.
Is it also because of like the way that people build memorials is based from the community itself, and so as like a gay community as a whole, there hasn't been a huge push to get those sort of memorials. But as in like the Jewish community, obviously like the Holocaust was such a big event that they could, as a community or as like, different communities in other places, like have that momentum and have the. They're not worried as much about like other like forms of prosecution, like or like different rights issues like the gay community has in America. So because we've still been fighting for our rights since 2014. So.
We meaning LGBTQ
Yeah.
folk? Yeah, I mean, look, and yes, LGBT folk are still fighting for their rights, and there's probably going to be fights happening until none of us is around on this earth. I would say the same thing about Jews as well. But trying to figure out how to answer your question. I don't know if there was what was the question? Okay. I think that was actually relates back to your question because you were answering. So I actually think we don't know enough about LGBT history as such to actually be able to put up memorials to, say, the burnings that took place during the Black Plague. And that might not have even been a socially operative category in those periods. So in the Middle Ages, for example, you have witch burnings and you have Jew burnings. But I don't think you have like, you have women who were loving other women and they were being burned, but they were being burned not because they were lesbians, they were being burned because they were presumed to be witches. So I just want to remind all of you young folk, which I'm very happy you guys are here. It really makes me happy, that you're at the vanguard. Like you are right now creating new histories and new identities that are going to be shaping how we talk about this into the future. Let's take these last 3.
Oh, it's just like a very short thing, which is that when we talk about LGBT history, often we take a very narrow point of view of it as like the West, and there is a long history of LGBTQ people across the world. It's just that in the West, we haven't really talked about it until like 60, 70 years ago. And especially because places like the Institute for Sexualwissenschaft were burned. That's all I want to say.
Just thinking that very question the whole time.
Curiosity, where is the nearest memorial to right here where we're sitting?
I am the worst person to answer that question since this is my first time in Bellingham. All right, welcome to Bellingham. Thank you. Do you want to take the other 2 questions? See if anybody can answer this gentleman's question.
I have a question on the irony of the governments who were bringing gay men to sleep at brothels, and then you said members of the governmental body were homosexuals themselves, and then it reminds me of Cuba too, when a lot of
I don't know much about Cuba.
it's similar, like innuendos bringing gay men to prisons, but they were also like their relationships in the camps between prison guards and these homosexual men. And so, I know you didn't talk about it much, but the irony that we see in these like prosecutors and they're like criminalizing in a country their own, I guess, their own internalized homophobia.
So, Roy Cohn, anyone? Mm-hmm. So, that is not specific to Nazi Germany. The United States has had, and I'm not going to go down that road. So Roy Cohn is a very famous example of a very harsh right-wing, what do I want to call him? Prosecutor. I'm just going to describe him, who basically got Ethel Rosenberg and Julius Rosenberg put to death. He was a gay man, and he also sort of helped lead the hunt for homosexuals in the government.
He certainly did not identify as gay.
But he was having...
Yes, but that's the irony.
Exactly.
It's like,
All right, two more questions. One, and did you have questions? And maybe this is the last question. Oh wait, you had one question as well? No. Okay, then this is the last question. It's all on you. No questions.
Good thing I selected a big one then. So I noticed that there wasn't much mention of transgender and intersex people with the Nazi persecution. It's not because it was a lot more, I guess, difficult to track.
So they would have also been the asocial category. So they existed, and actually Magnus Hirschfeld documented extensively transgender people. So he coined the term transvestite, and then he coined the word transsexual, and then he actually coined the word transgender, which like really radical for the 1920s and 1930s. And I think the first transition surgery took place in Germany in, I want to say 1930-ish, 32. So the Nazis then actually do persecute those people, but not under paragraph 175, under the asocial category.
Thank you so much. I just want to make a quick announcement that Hillel is apparently having a dinner after this, so if you're interested, please talk to Rachel, who is on the mic afterwards. And thank you so much for coming to talk to us, and thank you all for coming as well. There are also books at the back.
Oh, and right.
Yes, there are books at the back.